Hello and welcome to this yet another episode of the SoftCover, the Print's platform for the release of select non-fiction books. I'm Snehesh Alex Philip. Today's book is a very interesting book. A lot has been written on the subject, but this book promises to bring out certain new aspects to it. To cut it short, the book that we are releasing today on softcover is December in Dacca, the Indian Armed Forces and the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, written by K S Nair and published by, of course, the Harper Collins. So welcome to the show, Mr. Nair.
Thank you so much, Snehesh, and please feel free to address me as Shri.
Shri. Perfect. I'll call you Shri. And so Shri, before we go ahead, we'll show to our viewers. I have this wrap book here. We'll unwrap it for you viewers so that you get a glimpse of how the look. They say that never judge a book by the cover, but I can tell you that the cover is very beautiful. There you go. That is the December in Dacca, the Indian Armed Forces and the Bangladesh Liberation War 1971 by K S Nair, and of course published by the Harper Collins.
Indeed.
So to begin with, and I said this in my initial thing, there are a lot of books that have been written about the 1971 war. So what is so special about this book and why did you write?
Sure.
What's your connection to 1971?
Sure. Well, as to my connection to 1971, I was a schoolboy in shorts at the time of the 1971 war. And I've been wanting to write about the war since I was about a 12-year-old. And I have actually, in this book, I've occasionally dropped into what I've called the schoolboy perspective. So I've talked about how someone who was a schoolboy at the time of the 1971 war responded to what was publicly available at that time. And then I've added some of the historical material that we know is true. Now, what's different about it, I hesitate to say special because that's for the readers to say. But what's different about it, I think, as you and I both know, last year was the 50th anniversary of the war, and there were quite a few books that came out about the 1971 war. Now, and even earlier, there were some very, very good books, and I would single out, Srinath Raghavan's 1971. Which gave a sort of diplomatic history. Salil Tripathi's The Colonel Who Would Not Repent, which sort of gave a bit of a social history. And most recently, I think Chandrasekhar Das Gupta's India and the Bangladesh War, I think is the title, which gave a sort of political and diplomatic history. And there's also people, Jagan Mohan and Samir Chopra have done a book on the air war over Bangladesh, Eagles in Bangladesh, which is also a Harper Collins publication. Sandeep Unnithan has done Operation X, which covers a very little known piece. And Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam has covered it as part of other histories. Now, what I would say is different about this is all those, the three that I mentioned, Eagles over Bangladesh, Operation X, and India's wars, they cover the military aspects. And the diplomatic and political aspects are largely covered by Srinath Raghavan and Chandrasekhar Das Gupta. Yeah. Now, what I've tried to do here is to combine all of those into a single narrative, because I actually think the military narrative is incomplete without knowing a little bit about the about that social and political environment at a time when in many ways the deck was stacked completely against a successful from Bangladesh's point of view, a successful conclusion to the Bangladesh Liberation War. And I think in addition, December in Dhaka addresses an aspect of the war which I really thought would come out last year during the plethora of sort of events and publications that marked the 50th anniversary. Nobody really picked on this. And that is that even outside India, scholars of ethics and international jurisprudence they recognized the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War as one of the world's last just wars of the 20th century, a justifiable and essential war, which was conducted with the minimum amount of force required to accomplish those humanitarian objectives. So I think the victory is much more. The 71 victory is much more than just a military victory. It is a military victory, and we shouldn't forget that. But it's much more than a military victory. It was a diplomatic and political triumph, which has been brought out partly by Srinath Radhaman and Chandrasekhar Dasgupta. But it was much more. It was a humanitarian, most importantly, it was a humanitarian success against odds and against the most powerful nation in the world at that time, the United States, which was very much on the wrong side of that war.
Well, on the wrong side, what Steve mentions the wrong side is that the United States was actually supporting Pakistan. It first turned a blind eye to what was happening in East Pakistan, and then, tried to do its own bit of muscle flexing in the seas around us. In this book, you've mentioned that, given the scale of atrocity that was halted in his tracks, it is shocking that the compelling circumstances as well as numerous poignant and heartwarming stories of the war have failed to become iconic representations of military interventions and success in folklore and popular culture in India, Bangladesh, and beyond. I think a lot has happened in Bangladesh. It's part of the folklore.
Indeed.
But in India, I've always felt that everyone knows about the 1971 war as the Bangladesh Liberation War, where India helped in the liberation of Bangladesh. But why do you think this has happened? It is by design that has happened, or is it a mistake that has happened? Because at that time you had you had Indira Gandhi as the prime minister. It was I would also say that it was a military win as well as a political win, because Indira Gandhi had staked the entire thing on this particular war. Since then also it has been the Congress which was in power for the larger part of the decades. But why do you think this has happened? Why is the 1971 war missing from the narrative? Whenever we talk about war 65, 62, Kargil comes up. Not in the true sense 71. Why? Even though so many books have been written.
Yeah. Well, I actually spend about 20% or 15 or 20% of the book towards the end is actually spent partly on that. And I actually think a large contributor was India's failure to recognize the ethical and humanitarian dimensions of the war. I think one of the things you have to remember, Snehesh, is that we're talking about the early 70s, right? This was peak Cold War period, right? India was by no means as important in the world then as she is today. I think after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, 1991, after that period, I think the global business and political environment became much more aware of the developing world. Up to that point, they weren't interested in developing country markets. They were regarded as very difficult to break into. But today, I think developing countries, India and China, both are regarded as very, very important to the world. That was not true in 1971. Then, although we accomplished a victory, at the end of the victory, there was still a lot of residual hostility from the United States. The United States withheld recognition of Bangladesh as a country for months after after the Mujibur Rahman government took power, and I think I've actually written in here that if India had helped Bangladesh to set up a war crimes trial, a war crimes court after the 71 war, which had held the Pakistanis who deserved to be tried, and not all of them did. I have to say that many Pakistanis spoke out very bravely against the atrocities they were committing, and I've recognized some of them in the book. But if we had established something like a war crimes trial, something similar to the Nuremberg trials or the Tokyo trials after World War II, I think that would have contributed. But we just didn't have after having won the war at probably a lower cost than we expected, we didn't want to jeopardize that victory by getting into what would definitely have been a very, very controversial trial, because one of the characteristics of India-Pakistan wars is they're always contested. they're contested to a degree that very few other wars are. Right? And Pakistan and other countries which see themselves as supporting Pakistan on those issues, they always have a counter narrative. So pushing through a trial which would have established the narrative a little more strong, the humanitarian narrative a little more strongly, I think we just didn't have the energy for it. So we let it pass, we let it slide, we sent 93,000 prisoners of war back, which included 200 or 300 Pakistanis who'd been specifically identified by name as potentially guilty of war crimes. And you look at the amount of interest that's pouring into Ukraine now, into establishing guilt of war criminality. But there was nothing remotely like that. We were on our own, right? And I do talk a lot about how we were on our own. So I think that's one of the major contributors. And then, of course, 3 years after the war, in 1975, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was murdered in the first of a series of counter coups, and Bangladesh went through a really tumultuous period over that time. And unfortunately, I think the Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's murder coincided with the start of Indira Gandhi having imposed emergency in India. Right?
Exactly.
So I think our standing and our ability to stand up for democracy and say that murder, the murder suspects should be put on trial and not become the next government. I think our ability to say that was undermined by the fact that Indira Gandhi had just suspended, civil liberties in India. Right? So we couldn't really influence what happened in Bangladesh from there onwards. And it's worth adding that there are some writers who are absolutely convinced that Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's murder was Henry Kissinger's revenge for Indira Gandhi having made him look like an idiot during the 71 by her victory in the 71 war. So there are people who believe that it was CIA sponsored, CIA funded. Obviously, the Americans deny it, but there is a narrative to that effect in some parts of the world. So, as I say, a new Bangladeshi government came into power, headed by Ziaur Rahman, General Ziaur Rahman, which was less friendly to India. And Bangladesh went through a period of turmoil for about 10 years when there were a lot of coups and counter coups, and some governments which literally lasted just a few days before there was a counter coup. Right? And eventually it stabilized with a government under General Ziaur Rahman. And now Zia, you have to remember, Zia was a major at the time of the 71 when the 71 war started. But up to that point, for about 15 years or so, he had been an officer in the Pakistan army. He had been a regular officer in the Pakistan army. Right? So then, although he identified with the Bangladesh liberation cause, he was not as hostile to Pakistan as some other prominent Bangladeshis were. So during his period, there were a lot of repairs done to the relationship between Bangladesh and Pakistan. And in the period since then, when Begum Zia and Mujib's daughter have sort of alternated as a prime minister of Bangladesh, generally, in Begum Zia's time, the government has been a little more hostile. The Bangladesh government has been a little more hostile to India, and at other times, the Bangladesh government has been a little more positive and friendly towards India. So I think the combination of those circumstances have made it very difficult for us to sustain that narrative that this is really India's shining moment after independence, and we should preserve it and celebrate it for reasons beyond the military. And I think
I completely agree with you on that. But when someone reads a book, it lays a lot of emphasis, as you said, on the fact that India didn't build up on the moral standing that it had. What really went wrong? Because during the war or before the war, there was a lot of campaign that Indira Gandhi did at that time, showcased the need, what is happening. For example, you had and as this book rightly mentions, you had the worst migration. Not migration is the wrong word for it. Where over 10 million people,
10 million
refugees had crossed over, and this was huge in that day. So while India was building on that campaign, What happened? Why was the world not listening? Was it because of the Cold War?
Yeah, no, I think the Cold War had a lot to do, no question, the Cold War had a lot to do with it. I think, again, if you make a comparison with Ukraine today, it helps. Ukraine's narrative is helped very much by the fact that the Western alliance, if you like, which is really only about 20% of the world's population.
Yeah.
But the Western alliance has come down, the alliance of Western countries has come down very much on Ukraine's side. And Ukraine's communications and information war have been absolutely brilliant. Right? And they have so many prominent people who speak fluent English and speak on international channels in English. I mean, that I honestly believe that made a difference. Right now, in the case of the Bangladesh war, I think, as I say, within 3 years of the success, first it happened during a time when India's voice counted for much less. Within 3 years of the end of the war, it seemed to be that victory seemed to be turning to ashes after the murder of Mujib and the coups and all that. And there was very little interest in the West in sort of formulating and reiterating and emphasizing the narrative, because they didn't look good. Certainly, the United States, the U.S. government of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger as National Security Advisor at that time and Secretary of State immediately after, they don't come out looking good at all. So there was definitely, I think, an interest in not playing it up too much. The Cold War contributed. I think India sort of became identified with Russia to a greater political degree than we should have, because we had used Russian arms with so much success during that war, which was, again, it was unique. I mean, the Arabs had used Russian arms against Israel and failed. Communist China had used Russian arms against Taiwan and failed. So we were really the first country to accomplish a victory on this scale using primarily Russian equipment, although we still had a lot of legacy British equipment in hand. So I think all of those, am I sort of answering your question? I mean, I think all of those contributed to why that narrative fell by the wayside. Then, as I said, 3 years after, there was a change of government in Bangladesh, and then a lot of instability in Bangladesh. And then in 1977, Indira Gandhi was voted out. Okay? So, and for a few years, we had the Janata government from 1977 to 1980. Then Mrs. Gandhi did come back, but I think she had internal issues too that worried her and plagued her more than sort of trying to rehash her success or India's success in 1971. I think it's important to see that as India's success, not as Indira Gandhi's success. It was much more than that.
Absolutely. And when you talk about Bangladesh, there are multiple operations that people know about. But generally for our viewers, what is Operation Searchlight, and why is it one of the most dreadful, heinous, genocidal operation that was ever launched in the recent history of this modern world? What was this? What was Operation Searchlight?
So Operation Searchlight was the Yahya Khan government, the Pakistani Yahya Khan led government's attempt to put an end to the Bengali to the East Pakistan separation movement by force. From West Pakistan's point of view, they made some offers of compromises to existing laws, which would have given East Pakistan a little more autonomy. Yeah. But in December 1970, the primary East Pakistan political party, the Awami League, had won a massive majority in East Pakistan, so massive in East Pakistan that they actually had enough seats in the combined parliament to have ruled over all of Pakistan, which included West Pakistan. And I think to a large degree, the villain at that point, the villain who sort of dug his heels in and said, there is no way I'm going to allow a government dominated by East Pakistanis to rule over the whole of Pakistan, the villain of that was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, right? Because he did, he was head of the Pakistan People's Party, which had only about 20% or so. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was a relatively small proportion of the seats in that December 1970 Parliament, and he just refused to let anyone to let the Parliament convene, right? And if they had convened Parliament and allowed an Awami League government to form and allowed Mujib to become the Prime Minister of all of Pakistan, I think history would have taken a very different route. But be that as it may, Bhutto had dug in his heels and said he was not going to allow it. He had persuaded Yahya Khan, who was at that time the chief martial law administrator. And here, it's important to also note that Yahya Khan did not come to power through a military coup. He had assumed power through what they sometimes describe as an invited coup. Yeah. The military had been invited to form the government and take over the government. This is before a few years before the events in Bangladesh. So Yahya Khan was heading up the government as the chief martial law administrator. He didn't really have the imagination, I think, to see beyond the a military solution. And he was a sort of bluff, rough and gruff kind of soldier, and not a sophisticated politician who could see the advantages in negotiating and compromising and so on. And Bhutto, of course, was adamantly opposed to compromise. So, be that as it may, 3 months after that December 1970 election, skipping over a lot of detail, some of which is in the book, the Pakistani government, the West Pakistanis came to the conclusion that the only way to wrap up this issue once and for all was to implement, and they actually used the phrase final solution. They actually used that phrase. Less than 25 years after World War II, they used the phrase the final solution, which was a military crackdown against anyone in Bangladesh suspected of supporting the Awami League and the mild, up to that point, mild separatist movements that were in place. So Operation Searchlight was that military exercise. They had, by that time, they had tripled the number of Pakistani soldiers on the ground in East Pakistan. Between the December 1970 election, the results of which were never honored, and the March 25th, 1971 start of Operation Searchlight, the West Pakistanis had tripled the presence of primarily West Pakistani soldiers in East Pakistan. So they had about 3 divisions worth of troops in East Pakistan. They cracked down very, very hard. They, on the first night itself, they went into the University of Dacca and they hauled out any professors who had been, they had a long list of faculty members and student leaders who they thought had been insufficiently supportive of the unity of Pakistan. They just hauled them out into the courtyard and shot them in front of their families or within earshot of their families. Then out in the country, they started. They went after military-age males and slaughtering them when they could find them. They started burning down in Dhaka itself. They burned down many of the poorer quarters of Dhaka. And by the accounts of people who were in Dhaka at that time, it was really sort of stark, because they had actually burnt down the poor areas, and the wealthier areas with tall buildings were untouched around them. So that was Operation Searchlight, and that was the start of Operation Searchlight, and that was what triggered the first wave, the first massive flood of Bangladeshi refugees into India, which ultimately culminated, as you say, in 10 million refugees.
So how much, what were the casualty figures as far as which are there as far as Operation Searchlight is? How many people were actually butchered? And when I mean by people, viewers, it also means men, women, and children.
Yes. This is actually a very strongly contested figure.
Absolutely, now, as it should be though.
Yeah. The Bangladesh government says that 3 million people were killed, men, women, and children, mostly civilians. The Bangladeshis didn't have remotely that number of military personnel. So the Bangladeshi government says that 3 million people were killed. The Pakistani official inquiry, which was headed by quite a respectable judge of the Pakistani judicial system, Hamdur Rahman, the Hamdur Rahman report, which is otherwise quite scathing about the Pakistani actions. The Hamdur Rahman report itself pulls very few punches in terms of criticizing the actions of Pakistan during that period, but it says that the casualties were 30,000 and above. And very sadly, there's an Indian academician or an Indian origin academician by the name of Sharmila Bose, who's published a book called Dead Reckoning, right, in which she has by and large supported the Pakistani contention. Now, I outside the Pakistani establishment and Sharmila Bose, I don't think anyone buys that sub 50,000 number. Right? The official Bangladeshi account of 3 million can be questioned and challenged. Right?
Of course.
There has been no formal attempt to actually establish the correct number between those two. And even Srinath Raghavan, Raghavan is one of the most sort of historically thorough historians to have looked at the war. Even he's backed away from coming up with an exact number. He says, and I've quoted him in my book, he says, "My spirit quailed at the task." So short answer is we don't really know, but I think there's plenty of evidence that it was at least in the hundreds of thousands. And many neutral scholars accept that it was in the hundreds of thousands. Now, was it 300,000, 700,000, 500,000? At the upper end, that approaches 1 million. So, there isn't really a number. But there were, what is not disputed, because India has records of those, is that there were 10 million refugees. There were 10 million refugees who crossed into India. So,
while of course, as you mentioned right now, it was on the 25th when the Operation Searchlight, when the butcher was sent in. I mean, General Tika Khan was sent in.
Tika Khan, correct.
Yeah,
correct.
And but the war actually began on 3rd December. Now, there's of course, you and I know a lot of stories on this, but for the viewers, what was happening between, if yes, the butcher was there, Searchlight was opened up.
Yeah.
What was happening? Why did India take so much time to actually step in? December, from March to December is quite a long period of time.
It's a long period, yes, indeed. So I think that actually also became a little bit of a controversy recently when Chandrasekhar Dasgupta's book was published. But the historic sequence of events is that, as you say, the crackdown started on the 25th of March, and it was very clear within a few days that it was a horrific crackdown. Right?
Absolutely.
Quite early in April, I don't remember the exact date offhand, but it's in the book. Quite early in April, Mrs. Gandhi convened a cabinet meeting to which then General Manekshaw was summoned, and they discussed whether or not to start military operations immediately. And what is definite is that at the end of that meeting, the conclusion arrived at was that it would be sensible to wait for a few months because the army needed a few months to mobilize properly. They didn't have the offensive units positioned around Bangladesh, positioned around East Pakistan to undertake an offensive operation immediately. So that I think is fairly clear. And if we'd sort of, it would have taken a minimum of a few months to organize the armed forces to. I think it's worth adding that in '65 there was no significant fighting on the Eastern Front, because even in 1965, I think the Indian government had an inkling that East Pakistan was not as hostile to India as West Pakistan. Exactly. So in the '65 war, we didn't carry out much of an operation on the eastern side. So there really wasn't an established army, and indeed there was no navy. There was no Eastern Naval Command until a few months before the '71 war. Eastern Naval Command was formed only a few months before the '71 war. So, but to go back to your question, in that April '71 meeting, it was decided that we would wait, that we would give the armed forces time to prepare for an offensive operation. That would take a few months, and that would have taken them into the August or so time frame, at which time, as you and I know, the monsoons break. And however bad, however flooded the roads get in Bombay and Delhi, and the cities that you and I know well, the territory of Bangladesh, it's much, much worse. It gets inundated. Right? The monsoon hits and it becomes inundated. So a very sensible decision was taken that operations would only start around, at the earliest, in around November, after the monsoon had cleared and the ground had dried up somewhat. We've seen how the Russian army has struggled in muddy ground in Ukraine. We would have had much worse to deal with if we had gone in too early. So we did decide to wait till the monsoon was over. Now the controversy after Ambassador Dasgupta's book came out was essentially whether credit for that decision should go to Mrs. Gandhi or to General Manekshaw, which I think it's a non-issue. I think it's very clear that both of them had very good reasons of their own to come to the same conclusion, independently or otherwise. And whether or not the diplomats, whether or not Ambassador Dasgupta's colleagues advised waiting, or whether it was something that Manekshaw and Mrs. Gandhi came to independently, the reality is they wait. And Manekshaw's stories have gone around the web and WhatsApp, but that Mrs. Gandhi never spoke about what happened. She didn't live long enough to tell more stories. But those were the rational and perfectly justifiable reasons why we waited till November before launching offensive operations. And I think it's fair to say, Pakistanis will all throw this at us. It's fair to say that some small-scale defensive and proto-offensive operations had started before 3rd of December.
Absolutely. Those guerrilla warfare things, psyops, in actual operations had all began.
Operation X, which Sandeep Unitan has written about.
Shri, when you look back at this now, India-Bangladesh ties, you mentioned the fact that India was helped in the creation of Bangladesh. Since then, government on and off, the relationship has not been that great. In 2022, when you look at India-Bangladesh ties, where do you see it as heading? And is there a concern there? Is there a worry there?
As you say, Snehesh, the relationship between India and Bangladesh has fluctuated. And at times, when it's been low, there have been times when they've actually tried to whitewash out India's contribution to their liberation. In their Liberation Museum, they've taken down photographs of Indian soldiers and Indian contribution, even the surrender, the famous surrender photograph. I think that maps fairly closely to whether it's an Awami League or a Bangladesh National Party government. I think Awami League governments generally have which was the party founded by Mujibur Rahman. Awami League governments have no difficulty in acknowledging India's help, and we've generally managed to succeed in things like sorting out the various enclaves of territory on both sides of the border and so on. We've generally managed to do that with Awami League governments. The Bangladesh National Party governments have been a little more hostile, but I think things are changing, and I think it is worth saying. I think this does have to be said. I think a lot of Indians need to be reminded of this. Bangladesh, for many, many years, has actually shown better human development and social indicators than India has. Right? And that's partly because of the spread of things like microfinance and measures, social measures, intervention measures, which have helped the poorest among the Bangladeshi population. And the last couple of years, Bangladesh's per capita GDP has gone ahead of us. Right? So I think Bangladesh has done very well. And I think India should be proud. It's a bit like, so many people in our generation, Snehesh, if I can claim to be the same generation as you, so many people in our generation are making more money than our parents did.
Absolutely.
Right? And our parents are proud of it. Our parents are delighted, right? And they brag about it. Right? And I think we should in some ways feel that way about Bangladesh. We should never resent Bangladesh's success. We should always be happy for Bangladesh's success. And I think we need to keep saying that, and reminding other Indians that Bangladesh is not a basket case.
Well, there you go. Thank you so much, Shri, for talking to our viewers on The Print and for writing this book. Once again, viewers, this is December in Dacca, the Indian Armed Forces and the Bangladesh Liberation War by K S Nair, and of course, published by Harper Collins. Thank you so much, Shri, for
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Snehesh.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Real privilege.